Thank you, and good evening, Southport, once again. So yes, this is UFOs. They're rebranded as UAPs, but I'm going to stick to UFOs for the duration of this talk. And the main thrust of the talk is, as indicated in that little subtitle, I'm going to be looking at images. I'm not interested in people's reports. I'm not interested in alien abductions. I'm interested in looking at images to see if we can figure out what those images are. But first, just a little bit of setting the scene, as it were. You could argue that statistics don't lie. However, I found some statistics a few years back which were very interesting. Have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth? That's not a question for you. I don't want a show of hands. But when this question was asked by a university back in 2018 in America, they got the response, 40% said yes. That's a little bit interesting, isn't it? If you change the question slightly, are extraterrestrial aliens visiting now? Do aliens walk amongst us? You might assume the number would be a lot lower. Okay, 35%. But bear in mind, the reference is down here at the bottom of the screen there. This is from an American university, and I think they were surveying the students rather than the general population. So you could take this as a snapshot of what American students think, if you want. So 40 to 35% think that extraterrestrials exist and have visited and are visiting us. Bear in mind that 35% is less than the number who believe in ghosts in this same survey, but it's greater than those who believe in telekinesis, and it's greater than those who believe in Bigfoot. But the real problem I have with these statistics is that the number of people who think aliens visit us at the moment is greater than the number of people who believe in evolution. I'd love to know what the numbers are for the UK, or for the general population of the world, or the UK in particular. This is, of course, a rather limited snapshot. But this was the subject of a cartoon a few years back, where they showed a graph of how many people carry phones with them. And of course, that used to be a very small number. People didn't walk around with a camera, sorry, not phones, cameras. How many people walk around with a camera in their pocket? It used to be a very low number, but now digital phones are such that they have cameras built into them. The number of people who have a phone on them all the time has gone from almost zero to almost 100%. And so you could argue that with so many people having a phone on them all the time, the argument about whether or not flying saucers or lake monsters or ghosts or Bigfoot, that should now be laid to rest. You could argue that back in the 1980s, we weren't quite sure because whenever somebody saw something, nobody ever had a camera on them. But now you always have a camera on you. So is the whole issue of flying saucers settled? Well, apparently not. If you Google UFO, last time I tried this to get a number, the number of web pages that talk about UFOs is approximately 250 million. So there is still, for some reason, an interest in lights in the sky or UFOs. So that implies that despite the fact that there are so many cameras out there in various phones, it's not yet settled. So in this talk, I'm going to be looking at UFOs, and I'm going to classify them according to what I think they probably are. In other words, a lot of things that are labeled as UFOs, they could be man-made objects, they might be natural objects, they could be image artifacts, in other words, they are something in the image, nothing actually in the sky, or they could be deliberately faked. And of course, the elephant in the room is, well, actually, there is a fifth category, and the fifth category is they could be extraterrestrial spacecraft. So I'm going to look at each of those 5 categories. In terms of definitions, I'm going to stick to the usual definition of what people mean by a UFO. An object seen in the sky, maybe during the day, maybe during night, an object that cannot be readily identified. So it looks like it's flying, it may be flying, it may not be flying, but it can't be readily identified, so we're going to call it a UFO. But regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I would definitely side with Carl Sagan, who basically said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you want to make a claim and say there's proof that that's an alien spaceship, you need more than just a blurry photo. You need something very precise and extraordinary evidence if you want to make a claim like that. The other thing we're going to use is Occam's razor, the friend of every scientist, which basically says if there are two explanations for an observation and they both explain what you're seeing, then the explanation that requires the least speculation is probably the better of the two. The one that requires the least speculation is usually the better explanation. And you can simplify that further if you wish. Simpler solutions are more likely to be right than complex ones. So we're going to use that a number of different times in this talk. So where can you get reliable information on UFOs? Well, one place, of course, is America, where you can go to get all sorts of useful information. Notice the little alien sitting on the front porch there. And that's part of the problem. It would be great if UFO images looked like that. In other words, we know that's just CGI, that's just computer-generated imagery. But if we could get images that looked like this, that were clear, detailed, in focus, not with the camera moving, blurring the image, and well exposed, if we got images like that, then it would be a lot easier to say, is that something that's flying around because that's a new military aircraft, or is that a visitor from some other world? But unfortunately, UFO images don't look like that. They typically look like that. That is a typical UFO image. I tried trawling the internet to find as many as I could, internet and books and magazines, etc. And most UFO images look like that. And if you blow it up a bit, you learn absolutely nothing. It's just a bigger blur rather than a smaller blur. They're usually blurred. They're usually out of focus. Usually the camera is moving. Maybe the object is moving as well. Who can tell? If the camera's moving, how can you tell if the object is moving? And they're quite often overexposed. The other big problem, apart from the fact that 99% of UFO images can't be analyzed because they look like that, is also the fact they don't come with any useful data. So-called metadata is what we would call it these days. If you take a digital picture of your cat now with your phone or your digital camera, it will record the date it was taken, the time it was taken, the location, where in the world you were when you took the picture. It'll record the exposure. It'll record the aperture. It'll record the sensitivity of the chip. But if we're looking, for instance, at images from more than a few decades ago taken on analog film, we haven't got that information. I have got no idea who took that picture, where they were when they took it, which way were they pointing, what time of day was it, were they pointing up to the sky or down on the ground, what was the exposure, is that a short exposure or a long exposure, what was the aperture of the lens, which lens was used, which camera was used. We have none of that information. And because we have none of that information, we have absolutely no context. And therefore, that is just a blur. And there is nothing we can do about that. So the only ones that we can really analyze are the ones that either have got a credible provenance or one that were taken on digital cameras in which we know the various details of when and where and the details of the exposure, etc. I wondered how far back you need to go to find the first UFOs. And I saw this picture of hieroglyphs where there's clearly an Apache helicopter in the top left, and Luke Skywalker's landspeeder there, and probably a Zeppelin. So when I first saw this, I thought somebody's just been playing around with Photoshop. But then I dug a little deeper and I realized those are genuine hieroglyphics. And you look at that and you might say, well, if that's genuine hieroglyphics, then how could they possibly have drawn a helicopter and these various other things as well? But you do a little bit of digging and then you realize there is actually an explanation. There are actually two sets of hieroglyphs here because two pharaohs wanted their hieroglyphs on this piece of stone. And just like taking a piece of paper and trying to rub out the pencil and then draw another drawing, here they've basically chiseled over the top, and so you get both hieroglyphs showing through. If I show that again but color code it so you can see the two pharaohs, you can see that there isn't a helicopter or a speeder or a Zeppelin. It's just our eyes are caught by looking at the shapes of two sets of glyphs there. So unfortunately, that's a little bit of a red herring. So let's have a look at UFOs that might be more likely, according to Occam's razor, might be more likely to be man-made objects. The US Air Force has tried to make it easy for us. A number of people have seen UFOs flying over military air bases. This is nothing to do with top-secret planes. This is definitely UFOs. And just to make it clear, the US military has made it clear to identify these various objects. So I'm not sure if you can recognize that first object, but that's just a weather balloon. The second object is a weather balloon. The third object is a weather balloon. The fourth one is a weather balloon. The fifth one is a weather balloon. Any idea what this is? No, that's swamp gas. Then you've got a weather balloon and a weather balloon, and so clearly anybody that thinks they're seeing top secret or stealth aircraft are just being fooled by the fact they're seeing lots and lots of different weather balloons. Okay, that's a little bit of a spoof on the part of the US Air Force, but it reminds us that we have to be careful when we're trying to identify things. Here's an interesting picture that I found that I thought was worth putting into the talk. What do you think these white lines are? There's a little bit of there's a tree in the foreground, so there's a bit of foliage over there, and I think there's a leaf coming into there as well. But apart from that, what do you think the white lines are?
Contrails?
Yeah, of, what do you think, aircraft? Commercial aircraft? Military aircraft?
Either. Reflections.
Okay, let's take that one first. Aircraft don't fly like this. Aircraft do not fly 1 mile apart, stacked. They either follow the same corridors, they do not go side by side, so you would not expect that to be in formation. Military aircraft fly in formation, but not separated by that much, and they don't pull contrails when they're flying in formation. Generally speaking, if they are that high that they're making contrails, they'll be much further apart. They might fly in close formation for display purposes, but they won't be pulling contrails. Interesting that you say reflections, because this picture was actually taken from a particular web page, not one of my favorites, but it was taken from Pylon of the Month. Perhaps you haven't been to this particular web page. In December 2019, they published this photo because that is an electricity pylon, and it's a bit misty. It's a bit misty, so you can't actually see the pylon. But if I put the pylon in, then you can see exactly what it is, and it comes back to what was just mentioned here. It is ice on the cables, and the ice on the cables is simply reflecting some light, possibly the sun or artificial lights that are just over the horizon here. As soon as you take the pylon away, you're left with, again, a rather mysterious picture. But once your brain tells you there's a pylon there, then you can just see it as a whole load of cables. So no, this is not a long exposure. I said at the top there, a long exposure of a fleet of flying UFOs, question mark, knowing that it wasn't. It was actually a snapshot, not a long exposure. Again, if you don't know who took it and what the exposure was, you can easily be fooled into thinking you're seeing something that you're not. And if those of you who want to check out Pylon of the Month, if you happen to like the idea of looking at pylons, well, there it is, pylonofthemonth.org. I haven't checked it recently to check it's still valid. And of course, more recently, we've seen launches of rockets that produce some rather wonderful things in the sky. I mean, if you didn't realize a rocket had just been launched, who would not look at that and not think, wow, that's some UFO jellyfish flying through the sky? Sometimes the exhaust of these rockets stays in the atmosphere for quite some time and produces rather wonderful colors and shapes as the exhaust from the rockets basically just lingers in the atmosphere. And sometimes the actual contrail left by the rocket, because the atmosphere is always in motion, sometimes that contrail, which might start off as a straight line, gets wound up by lots of different air currents. And because the rocket engine has left aerosols in its wake, you sometimes get these beautiful iridescent colors. So again, it looks rather odd, but a perfectly natural occurrence, or at least natural in the sense of it was man-made, but we understand how it was created. In some cases, it's quite definitely man-made in the sense that if you saw this without explanation, you might think these lights in the sky look extremely odd and they don't look man-made, so maybe these are alien visitors. But this is simply some people doing an experiment. A sounding rocket has been sent up to release some gases which are fluorescent. Different gases are released at different heights. They fluoresce in different colors. And if you release the gas and then watch what happens, photograph the trails that are left, you can get an idea of how the upper atmosphere is moving, what jet streams occur, etc., and what exactly is going on in terms of how the molecules mix in the upper atmosphere. Helps us understand atmospheric dynamics. It might help us understand aurora. So this is simply part of an experiment. And you can see occasionally I put a reference in the bottom right-hand corner, APOD, the astronomy picture of the day. If anybody is interested, you can always follow this up and get more information by just going to that particular web page. Now, we've seen a lot of these recently. A few years ago, this would have been considered very odd to see lots of lights in the sky, floating around, changing colors, changing shape. It never necessarily ends up looking like a flying saucer, but 10 or 20 years ago, if somebody had seen these, they would be rather perplexed by what actually was going on, and it looks very unusual, and it doesn't look very man-made. But now we're used to the idea of drones being sent up into the sky, and we've seen it all the time at the coronation, for instance. The precision has got so good that instead of having a rather ragged display of lots of dots in the sky, you can position these drones extremely accurately, and so you can basically trace out any shape you like. So there's still the possibility of somebody getting a big drone constellation and forming it up in the shape of a flying saucer or something, but now we're used to the idea of drones, then that's rather more difficult to mistake for a UFO. Some people have claimed, well, there's clearly UFO landing sites because we've flown over a particular part of America and we've looked down and we've seen these huge, great landing pads in the middle of the desert. What else could they possibly be? Well, the simplest solution is to figure out where you were when you took the picture, because if you know when you took off and you know when you landed, you can work out roughly where you were when you took this picture and go on Google Earth and have a look. And what you find is, oh, there's a big solar plant there. Yes. And there's thousands of these mirrors. And depending on the angle of the mirror, which of course are all different depending on where you are in the sky, and each mirror is in a slightly different position, you can get some odd reflective properties. So they look odd from a few miles up, but nothing particularly unusual in that respect. There's plenty of not so much static images, but videos on YouTube of this ilk. People running around, notice how unsteady the video is. This seems to be a characteristic of all UFOs. And they are screaming, look at this object, it's floating above the lake here. It is obviously extraterrestrial because there is no man-made technology that can possibly produce a large cigar like that floating above a lake. That gets posted on YouTube and gets a few million hits, even though the following day Goodyear say, well, sorry guys, but that was us. I mean, it's a Goodyear blimp. I mean, we've known about these things. It goes to every sports stadium to take pictures from above, etc. Even when it was explained that this is just a blimp floating on the other side of the lake, it still gets millions of YouTube hits from people who want to believe it's extraterrestrial rather than the more mundane explanation. When I saw something, because once you start looking at YouTube, it's very difficult not to jump from one to another to another to another. I saw this link that said super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, fantastic, at last, super clear. That means somebody finally has got a camera and they've pointed it at a UFO and it's not jumping around all over the place. Right, let's go and watch this super clear footage. Let's see what it is. Any idea what it was? Can you tell from that what it was? You can appreciate the problem. People have cameras with enormous zoom lenses and they insist on taking it to the full zoom, and then they can't frame the object they're trying to photograph. But eventually, despite the fact that this person got very excited about his super clear UFO, he did eventually settle down and eventually got a slightly clearer, and ultimately I'll freeze it on one frame where you can see precisely what it is. Somebody called Jamie or Jennifer or John had a birthday party and the balloon got away. Okay, so it's a mylar balloon reflecting the sun. They can be seen from enormous distances, so they are odd in that sense. And you don't often see them in the sky, but when you do, it's fairly clear it's just a balloon floating up there. Although this talk was supposed to be about images, I was thinking explicitly about still images. But because I got sidetracked onto YouTube, I decided that it was worth looking at one video. And one video piqued my interest because it started with some introduction along the line of Puerto Rico, close to the Bermuda Triangle, almost in the Bermuda Triangle, may explain why it's a hotbed for UFOs. And it said there's been countless UFO sightings, but many experts consider the following video to be the gold standard. So I thought, I am not going to watch 1,000 videos of people who claim to be imaging UFOs. But if experts, I don't know who these experts are, but if they say that this video is the gold standard, the 100% proof, then perhaps it's worth having a look at. So I decided to have a look at this particular video. And it was taken by the US Customs and Border Patrol. Now, I figured that they probably, because they're American and because they are interested in illegal immigrants or basically the importation of certain undesirable substances, basically smuggling in, whether it be drugs or other things, they probably have aircraft fitted with state-of-the-art cameras. So I figured that this is probably good quality stuff. So I decided to give this video a watch. And they've taken an image of this object. It's infrared, dark means hot, light means cold. And they were imaging this object for quite a while. It's flying over the fields, some cows in the background there. It seems to be going quite fast. They occasionally lose it and pick it up again. And they are tracking it, apparently, at quite high speeds. It goes across a number of fields in front of a few houses. Then it crosses over an airfield, which will be coming up shortly once it's gone past a few other bits and pieces. So we are still not quite there yet. That looks like the taxiway of the airport in Puerto Rico, and then it's overflying the runway of the airport, and then it's flying off over towards the sea. So this has been claimed to be irrefutable evidence that an object is flying over Puerto Rico, and there's loads of other videos similar to this showing other orbs or objects flying over the skies, apparently moving at high speed. And I thought, well, it's worth dissecting this for a number of different reasons. Firstly, we can say, well, there's clearly something there. That's fair enough. It appears to be warmer than its surroundings. That's fair enough. But I wanted to have a crack at this because of the information that comes in this infrared camera. For instance, down in the bottom left, every frame is stamped with the GPS location of where the aircraft was. This is really useful information. Rather than just saying there's a blob in the field of view of the camera, we know frame by frame exactly where the camera was in the aircraft. And on the bottom right is the target. In other words, we know exactly where the camera was pointing. This is indeed a high-tech camera. It knows where the aircraft is from GPS, and it knows where the camera is looking in terms of azimuth and altitude and where it is, and it's worked out what particular point on the ground, what is the GPS location of the point on the ground. In other words, that point there, what is the GPS location of that point? And that is extremely valuable information if you want to make sense of what this video is actually telling you. So we know that this object is relatively dark, so it's relatively warm. These objects appear to be animals in a field, so I'm guessing they're probably cows from looking up what goes on in Puerto Rico. So this object is no bigger than a cow and about the same temperature as a cow. And when it's flying over the road, again, we have some cars on the road whose engines appear to be warmer than the rest of the car. That's no surprise either. But when it comes to the GPS, I thought this should be possible to dissect to see what's going on here. So I took the GPS coordinates frame by frame and figured out what was going on. So this is where the action is in Puerto Rico, just above the airport. Let me, that's 1 kilometer, by the way, just for a sense of scale. Let me just get rid of some of the details so we can see the track more clearly. The track of the bottom right, the target, in other words, where was the camera looking, those are blue dots. I haven't done every frame of the video. I've taken about half the video, and every 10th frame, or every 30 seconds, I put a dot showing you where the object seems to have moved. And a lot of people say, look at that, the object is moving in that direction, but on this day there was an 18 knot, or 18 miles an hour, I'm not sure, moderate breeze coming from the northeast. So the wind is blowing towards the southwest. This object is moving into the wind. This thing is not getting blown by the wind, it is moving against the wind. So it's going very fast, many hundreds of miles an hour, and it's heading into the wind. There is no object we know of that can possibly do this. Well, I thought, well, okay, maybe. But let's have a look at where the aircraft was when this ground track was taken. Those are the corresponding points to where the aircraft was. Notice it's flying in the opposite direction. So the aircraft is flying ultimately towards the south, and the UFO appears to be moving towards the north. But remember, the blue dot is really just where the object appears to be. It is basically where is the land just behind the object. So we can draw a line and ask ourselves how the UFO is moved. In other words, from that red dot, we can say the UFO was somewhere, and effectively it appeared to have a footprint where the blue dot is. Let's follow the aircraft round and then see where it appears to be next. And let's follow the aircraft round, and let's follow the aircraft round, and let's follow the aircraft round. What do you notice about all those lines of sight? They all intersect. So is it possible that the object is actually going hell for leather along the ground, or is it possible that it's just a static object sitting where that black dot is? And the only reason it appears to be moving hell for leather to the left is because the aircraft is moving hell for leather to the right at quite a few hundred knots, which is what aircraft tend to do when they're flying. I followed this a little bit further and continued on down. And not surprisingly, if you carry on for another few minutes, then the object appears to be over the sea. A lot of people say this is really weird because the UFO appears to go over the sea and then disappear and then reappear. No, the object isn't going anywhere. It only appears to be over the sea because the aircraft is now a long, long, long way south. When I worked out the positions of the object when the aircraft was a long way away, the object appeared to have moved slightly. The object appeared to have drifted a little bit in that direction. Remember which way the wind is blowing? Okay. So people make various claims when they see these videos. It doesn't matter whether it's the US Customs or whether it's the US Navy. Lots of these videos appear on YouTube showing objects moving hell for leather, apparently. But no, that's just because the aircraft themselves are moving really fast. So this was quoted as being the gold standard according to experts. They never tell you who the experts are, but according to experts, this was the gold standard. And the YouTube description says we can clearly see a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no obvious propulsion into an 18 miles per hour headwind. The infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. Apart from the bad grammar, that is basically wrong. We can employ Occam's razor, because when we look at this, we can say, well, is there any proof that it's a metallic orb? Well, it's a splodge. Whether it's an orb or not, maybe. Is it metallic? No way to tell if it's metallic or not. Moving at credible speed. You can't tell the speed of an object just because it seems to be moving relative to the background. You have to know whether the background is moving or whether the camera is moving. Is there no obvious propulsion? Well, that's true. I don't see any engines on this blob, so yes, no obvious propulsion. And it's going into an 18 miles an hour headwind. Well, no. Only if you believe it's actually moving in that direction. And this idea that it doesn't match anything we know of, well, that's just a throwaway statement which doesn't actually mean anything. I would argue that the object is essentially static. I would argue that maybe it's just drifting a little bit downwind over the many, many minutes of the video. I think it's a balloon. That means this thing, no obvious propulsion. Well, there is an obvious propulsion if you accept the fact that it's drifting downwind. The propulsion is the wind is blowing it, so that's wrong as well. So Occam's razor says, which is more likely? It's a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no propulsion into a headwind, or is it just a party balloon that got out of somebody's hands and is floating somewhere near to the airfield? Occam's razor says what's on the right is probably much more likely than what's on the left. And this is supposedly the gold standard of videos. I think all the other videos that are out there are less convincing than that, and you can always tear these to pieces quite readily. So that's man-made objects. What about natural objects? We've had Pylon of the Month. Now we're moving towards Cloud of the Month. Yes, the Cloud Appreciation Society, which some of you may have heard of. It's probably a little more popular than Pylon of the Month on the whole. So yes, there are lots of clouds around that produce interesting looking clouds. Whether they look like UFOs or not, well, that's up to you, I guess. The one on the top right is interesting because it appears to be a sort of fairy ring within the cloud itself, and that looks a little bit odd that you get this particular structure. But it can be explained if you think that, well, okay, there's an airfield not that far away, and if a plane happens to be circling before it comes into land, if the plane is circling in the cloud, it can disturb the cloud, and just underneath the plane, it might produce a little bit of the bubbling that you see there, and it only looks like a circle because the plane is effectively doing either a circle or a half track whilst waiting to land. There are some spectacular looking thunderclouds out there, but they are interesting, but I don't think anybody would say necessarily that looks like a UFO unless you really like the opening sequence of Independence Day, when that is sort of what happens when the spaceship comes crashing down on Earth. That again looks odd when you have a cloud bank that seems to have a big hole punched in it. But punching holes in clouds is not only done by large spacecraft that come landing, it can occur by understood meteorological conditions, which I'm not going to go into, but again, you can go to Cloud of the Month if you want to read more about that. That was September of a few years ago. There are some spectacular clouds that can form over, for instance, in this case, Mount Fuji, but even though they are spectacular, whether or not people would regard that as being artificial, they can be spectacular, but that doesn't stop people taking a beautiful image like that and sticking it in Photoshop and basically augmenting it to make it look even more weird, but that's just because people want to put interesting photos on the web, basically. But there are various natural phenomena which can look very odd to start with. So here it looks like there's a whole load of searchlights just over the horizon pointing up at the sky. There were no searchlights, there were some street lights just over the rooftops there, but apart from that, there was nothing else unusual about the particular scene. But it's understood that you can get this phenomena from ice crystals, depending on, you can see that in this case it is cold because there's snow on the ground. Ice crystals are little hexagonal plates. They can often sit horizontally such that you can reflect lights from a distance. In effect, they're behaving like lots of mirrors. And so there are street lights at the base of each of these light pillars, and the ice crystals are simply floating in the atmosphere and reflecting the light, the more distant light. And as soon as you understand that, then it all makes sense. It can still be a very pretty situation. It can still be rather spectacular. And the colors you see here are simply the result of different colored streetlights in the distance. But it can give a really weird result if the lights are in the very distant horizon, many, many miles away, and if the ice crystals are high in the atmosphere, you can get this rather odd situation where you see a reflection of a distant, perhaps town, perhaps city. You can see a reflection in the sky. It gives this impression there's a huge city in the sky. I've never seen this for myself, but I gather it's not that uncommon from northerly latitudes where you tend to have a lot of ice in the atmosphere. So these light pillars, perhaps worth looking out for if you're ever taking a holiday in Scandinavia or anywhere else further north. Odd things can happen. Although the light pillars, generally speaking, will be pillars above a light source, these ice crystals can be destabilized. As you get higher, the conditions sometimes warm to the point where the ice crystals start moving around, and so the light pillars start fanning out, and you get this rather odd situation that looks almost like trees growing from each of the light sources in the foreground. But again, if you understand what you're looking at, there's no reason to think that there's anything alien about these various objects in the sky. What about this thing? This is a picture of a thunderstorm with a house either side to block out the sun, and we're interested in this object in the middle there that appears to be flicking and jumping very rapidly. So we're looking at something that's probably quite a few miles away, and yet in a fraction of a second it seems to jump, implying that there is something moving there with enormous speed, and then back again, then jumps, and then back again. Can we explain what's going on there rather than a UFO is hiding in this cloud and its propulsion system is causing some odd effects in the cloud itself? Well, again, it's not something you see very often, and it does tend to only occur in thunderstorms where there are very large electric fields. What's probably happening here is, again, we've got orientation of ice crystals. So although you see an arc which appears to move, nothing is actually moving in the sense of moving to the left or moving to the right. It simply means that various ice crystals are being oriented because there's an electric field in the thundercloud. And if the electric field suddenly changes because, for instance, over here somewhere there's a lightning strike and suddenly the charge in the cloud changes, it can change the electric field in the cloud and the ice crystals reorient themselves and hence reflect light in a different way. So they're not physically moving, nothing is being transported from A to B. It's like having lots of tiny mirrors which simply are moving and relocating, changing their angle, changing their orientation, so that it changes the way they appear to be reflecting light. These could easily be thought of as UFOs, and it was only relatively recently we've begun to understand what these are. Red sprites. 20 years ago, people weren't actually sure whether they existed because some people said we've seen rather odd red things appearing above thunderstorms. So you're used to the idea that if you've got a thunderstorm, you get lightning strikes discharging the buildup of charge to the ground or possibly from one cloud to another. But it's now established that you can get some rather interesting electric phenomena above thunderclouds, these red sprites, which exist only for a fraction of a second. And that particular picture doesn't do it justice. This was a picture, astronomy picture of the day in 2017, but I noticed a couple of weeks ago an update to that, astronomy picture of the day 2023, showed these red sprites in incredible detail. I'm not too sure exactly how they took this picture, but what on earth is going on there? This is still an active area of research. It looks like sort of lightning forks at the bottom, but then you have these very odd sort of fuzzy cones at the top. What is going on? We thought we understood thunderstorms. We thought charge built up and then lightning discharged to Earth. So what's going on the top of thunderstorms? So this is now an active area of research. But when you look at a picture like that, you'd be quite forgiven if you saw that picture out of context and asked what's going on. You can quite imagine that plenty of people would say, we're being invaded, obviously. These things are coming out of the sky and are threatening us. So that's active research. Who knows where that's going to go in years and decades to come. Here's another little account, which I thought was interesting. Somebody said, near the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. Any idea what might be brilliant white in the evening sky? In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion is a UFO. A UFO is a knee-jerk reaction of, I don't know what it is, therefore it's a UFO. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. How can you work out how big an object is if you don't know how far away it is? If you've got a light in the sky, and quite often a UFO is a light in the sky, if you don't actually know the distance, how can you possibly judge the size? A lot of people seem to talk about it was this big or that big, rather than saying it was this much of sky that it covered or that much sky. It would be fine if they say it looked like it was the same size as an airliner at a distance of 500 meters or an airliner at a distance of 2 kilometers. But no, they just say, I think the object is as big as 2 airliners. Sorry, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. So again, but if you can't judge distance, the concept of size is just completely immaterial, especially as this particular object, a bright light in the sky that you see in the evening after sunset, and it's arc-shaped or crescent-shaped. So what object is that? It's Venus. So yes, he did have a camera and he put it on full zoom and he obtained this crescent Venus, but didn't understand what he was looking at, so he posted it as a UFO. And yes, it's quite definitely bigger than an airliner because it's Venus. Yeah. Okay, so we've looked at man-made, we've looked at natural. Let's have a look at artifacts. There's plenty of examples that you see, especially on reports in social media, of, I took this picture and it shows a UFO. I don't remember seeing it at the time. In other words, I couldn't see the UFO, but I've taken the picture and lo and behold, it's on the picture. So rather than say, well, obviously it's something wrong with the picture, they say, for some reason, I couldn't see it. Obviously, the UFO was interfering with my ability to see it, and yet the camera managed to catch it. Very rarely is that ever the case. There's nearly always a simple explanation in terms of the artifacts that occur in any form of photography. 1952, mysterious lights in the sky photographed over Washington, D.C., over the Capitol building. So you might say, well, yeah, there's obviously these sort of little double dots, these what, fireflies? Is it a whole fleet of UFOs going over the Capitol building? Are they interested in the White House? Are they interested in other things? Well, possibly. Or you look for a more down-to-earth explanation, and you look down here. And you take those lights, and you take the lights, and you turn them upside down, and then you take them to the top of the picture rather than the bottom of the picture. What do you see? Light, 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 light. In other words, it's an exact mirror of the lights in the foreground. All we're looking at is reflections. The reflections are not as bright as the original because that's how camera lenses work. They're supposed to take the light and focus them to make an image. Some of the light reflects off various interfaces between lens and air, so there's various surfaces in your camera lens that will reflect light, and generally speaking, the reflections will be fainter than the original. But here, there's an exact match, so it's fairly obvious this is nothing to do with UFOs. That's just an artifact in the image. This one, I couldn't help laugh at this particular one. Here we clearly see what is a UFO. The large craft, it was said by the person who took this image, the large craft came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. I don't know what the windows are. I think they might be referring to this thing here, which is clearly the pilot looking out of the window, piloting this particular spacecraft. UFO sighting is 100% proof aliens are here on Earth. Not only is it 100%, look at that. It's in capitals. It really must be true because it's in capitals. So yeah, proof of aliens. That itself doesn't say much. If you take it in context and look at the complete picture, not just that on its own, you realize it was actually taken whilst the camera was pointing at a very bright moon. I'm assuming this is the moon because it doesn't look like a daylight shot. So probably, given that there are some trees down there, I would imagine somebody took a landscape, the moon looked pretty, they took a picture of the moon, the very bright moon is rattling around, the light is rattling around inside this camera lens, some of it is forming the image, and a few % of it is forming a really weird looking reflection. Why is the reflection so distorted? I don't know. I don't know which lens was used because this is an old image and it hasn't recorded which lens, which camera, what exposure, etc. But I would hazard a guess that is simply a distorted reflection of a very bright object which otherwise would be overexposed by a factor of 100 or something like that. So no, not an alien, not a spacecraft window, not a pilot. In a similar vein, here's a picture taken by somebody who posted on Twitter. I don't generally look at Twitter, but just for doing research for this talk, I had a look at a few reports that were posted under UFOs, and this person took a rather nice picture of this lamp, but only once they had looked at the picture did they realize there was something interesting. What's that in the sky? I was trying to photograph this lamp with the sun just peeking around the wall, but what's this UFO that seems to be in the sky? It seems to have a little bit of an aura around it, a little bit of a glow. Is it a UFO? And just to show that this person was seriously asking the question, they then added #UFO. And then they added #serious question. In other words, somebody please tell me what this is, as opposed to, at least they're saying, is it a UFO, as opposed to, I think I've seen a UFO. But again, they didn't see it at the time, so it's probably an image artifact. And it doesn't take that much to look at this and say to yourself, well, what's the brightest thing in the image? The sun is peeking through. The sun is peeking through, there's a wall there, so part of the sun is hidden. The sun is a disk. If you hide part of the sun, what do you end up with? You end up with a disk that's slightly chopped off. And what's it shining through? The filigree work of this light holder. And that's exactly what you can see there. If we blow it up, you can see that it's the sun peeking around the wall. It's upside down because reflections tend to be upside down. So the sun's on the left, the reflection has the sun on the right, and it has a few bits of ironwork in it because the sun is shining through this particular bit of ironwork there. So that is pretty much exactly what you would expect if you shoot into the sun and have a very bright sun reflecting off your lenses somewhere in your image, usually on the other side of the image. So if the center of the image is up there, the sun's down here, so the reflection is on the other side of the center. That's pretty much exactly what you would expect if you photograph a very bright object. So no surprise there. I quite like this one as well. We saw this slab floating in the sky. Clearly, this is a picture through a windscreen. You can see raindrops on the windscreen. It's clearly a rainy night. There's rain, and this person said what we saw appears to be a flat rectangular aircraft with lights all the way around the edge, hovering in the air. And then they embellish that by saying UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spy craft known as a TR-3B, as if giving it a few letters and numbers adds authenticity to the claim that this is a UFO. So yes, it might be a big slab floating in the sky, but we're shooting through a windscreen. Is it possible that instead of a big flat slab floating in the sky, is it possible that you're shooting through a windscreen and sitting on the dashboard is a mobile phone? Some mobile phones have metal around the edge, and they give precisely that sort of picture. So Occam's razor says, I don't really think that's a slab floating in the sky. I think that's someone's phone sitting on the dashboard when they took the picture. We've had man-made, we've had natural, we've had artifacts. And of course, in some cases, people are simply trying to fake the images. So any image in which somebody has to point at it to tell you which is the UFO, clearly that's, that was just, I think, a little bit of fun. And so is that. If a spacecraft appeared in front of a few thousand motorists, I think we'd probably hear about it. So yes, this is just another bit of computer-generated imagery. But you do get some interesting old images. Again, this is pre-digital, so you have to be careful. You don't really know the provenance. But looking at this, because my research involves image analysis and image processing, it doesn't take me long to realize this is fake, because if we look at the spacecraft and we look at the whatever these are, I'm not sure if they're phone lines or power lines going across these posts. If we have a look at the spacecraft and we have a look at the power lines, very crisp lines here, so they're very well focused. So it's probably, the camera is probably focused on infinity and taking a picture of the landscape, as it were. If you're focused virtually on infinity, why would this spacecraft be blurred? It's not blurred because it's moving. If it was moving, it would be blurred in one direction and not the other. This is simply being blurred deliberately so you can't see any detail in the UFO. And it's been blurred too much. If that was authentic, it wouldn't be blurred as much, because you can see what the resolution of the camera is by looking at these thin wires. And that's quite a common way of finding things that don't look right. I found this particular image. It doesn't look like much, admittedly. This is a still from a YouTube video, and it doesn't look like much, except that this is apparently shocking new footage of an alien spaceship over Chicago. I thought if it's really that shocking, it's probably worth a look. So I took a still of the video, and the UFO is in the middle there, but it's a bit difficult to see. So I took it out and enhanced it so you can see it more clearly. And there's the triangular UFO that they said they saw over Chicago. But if you look at the background, you can see a whole load of noise. That's perfectly normal. When you take a low-light image, especially if you save it as a JPEG, which is a compression routine that produces a little bit of noise in the image, it's perfectly natural that a background sky, regardless of whether it's blue sky or night sky, will have a mottled appearance because of the noise in the image. But look how razor sharp those edges of the triangle are. That just does not look right. If this was a genuine image and that was a genuine triangular UFO, its edges would be as ill-defined as some of this background mottling would be. In other words, when these people have faked the UFO, they've made it not too fuzzy, they've made it too sharp. Getting it right is a bit of an art. Are these two UFOs buzzing Air Force One coming into land? Well, possibly, but I don't think so. The Air Force One aircraft is at a great distance, and when objects are at a great distance, the air between you and the aircraft causes a blurring effect and a lowering of contrast. So the underbelly of the aircraft isn't black, it isn't particularly dark, it's just a sort of medium grey because there's so much light scattering of all the air between you and the Air Force One. If these objects, if these UFOs are actually buzzing Air Force One, they're at a similar distance. If they're at a similar distance, they ought to have vaguely similar contrast, even if they were very dark objects, even if they were jet black. The scattering produced by the air between us and Air Force One would have reduced that black to a dark grey, and they just do not look right. The contrast of those two objects don't match the contrast of Air Force One. They've been added afterwards. Here's a triangular, I don't know why triangular these days, but here's a triangular UFO sitting on the deck of an aircraft carrier. Is there any evidence that this is not a genuine image? Apart from the fact you don't often see triangular aircraft sitting on aircraft carriers, is there any evidence that this has been tampered with? Again, this is my speciality in my research. So I had a look at various pixels along this grey line sitting next to the F-18 jet. As far as I can tell, the F-18 jet is genuine. And when I looked at pixel values here, the vertical scale here is just how bright those pixels are, and the horizontal line is just a line moving along this grey patch of deck. And you can see that it goes up and down a bit and it's a little bit noisy. Again, that's perfectly normal. You will always get some variation. Even if you think the deck of this aircraft should be absolutely smooth grey, when you take a picture there will always be some variation, and that variation that we can see there near the F-18 jet is perfectly understandable. What if we do the same thing and look at how bright are the pixels in the neighbourhood of the triangular UFO? Perfectly normal sort of variation, then whoa, what's going on here? Dead, dead, dead flat, and then some variation again. That is an absolute smoking gun that these pixels between whatever it is, 20 and 50, in this region here, have been replaced with pixels of exactly the same brightness, not a little bit of variation, but exactly the same brightness. So that is completely unnatural, that plateau in the middle, and that is an absolute signature that the image has been doctored. No surprise as far as I was concerned, but it was nice to see the proof there when you look at pixel by pixel at what's going on. This is a still from a video in which somebody said they were looking out their window and they saw a UFO fly by in the opposite direction. Well, maybe they did, but when you look at the video and you take out a still and you look at that UFO very closely, it seems to be exactly the same as the sort of CGI that you find in certain well-known games that your younger relatives might be playing all the time. So again, it's fairly obvious where they got that from. They took a normal video taken out of the aircraft window and then added a CGI aircraft to make it look like a UFO was buzzing past them. That's part of the problem. CGI is getting so good. Computer-generated imagery is getting more and more difficult to spot. So if they don't do it very well, it's very easy to spot. But the quality of computer-generated imagery, let's face it, when you go to the movies, whether you watch Jurassic Park or Independence Day, can you tell that what you're looking at isn't real? Can you tell it looks like a model? Can you tell it looks like it was generated by a computer rather than actually sitting there in front of the actors? No, computer-generated imagery is getting so good, won't be long before it's absolutely impossible to tell the difference between a genuine picture and one that has been doctored. So for the time being, we can tell. In the future, it won't be so easy. So I've been through man-made, I've been through natural, I've been through image artifacts, I've been through fakery. And of course, the elephant in the room is, well, there is one other possible explanation for UFOs, and that is they are extraterrestrial spacecraft. Somebody's documented them all, by the way. So they've actually said that UFO sightings, they fall into classifications, A1, A2, A3, A4, and there's quite a lot of them. Not only that, but I noticed that it says down here, 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. Yep, so these are actually documented sightings from somebody, somewhere, probably America, where they've actually said that these fall into these categories. But I thought this was quite interesting, not simply because there are 80 based on actual sightings, but because this is set 1. So there's probably another 80 out there somewhere, I just haven't found them. So maybe there are 160 UFO types out there that we are missing. But interestingly enough, just relatively recently, literally just a few weeks back, NASA published its report on UAPs. They're not calling them UFOs, they've changed it to UAPs. Originally unidentified aerial phenomena, now unidentified anomalous phenomena, but still calling them UAPs. I pulled something out of the final paragraphs, which I found quite interesting. A, they quote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Even before I saw this report, that's obviously what I put in the start of this talk. I also said in my talk that one of the problems with UFOs is we don't have enough data. We don't know who took it, where it was taken, everything else. NASA have said exactly the same thing. Metadata, the additional data apart from the image itself, are often absent, making an understanding of context either difficult or in many cases absolutely impossible. And they conclude there is no conclusive evidence suggesting extraterrestrial origin. If NASA had come to me, I could have told them all this in the first place, rather than spending a few $1 million actually coming to essentially the same solution, the same conclusion. There's not enough data, there's not enough good data, and virtually all the data that we currently have can be explained away 99.9% of the time using much more mundane explanations. That still leaves a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of wiggle room for the conspiracy theorists, but basically that's life. So, if the extraterrestrials are out there, well, maybe UFOs aren't evidence that they visited, but we can still ask ourselves about, well, the lack of evidence for UFOs being extraterrestrial doesn't get round the problem that we have to explain why we haven't been visited. If the number of stars in the Milky Way is something like maybe 300 billion, most have got planetary systems, so we'd have to divide that number by 2 to work out how many planetary systems there are in our galaxy. And we now know, because of all the work that's been done on exoplanets, a few decades ago we really had no idea how many solar systems existed and how many Earth-like planets existed. But now we've got a much better idea. The number of Earth-like planets is roughly 1/3 of the total. That's a huge fraction. It's not 1 in a billion, it's 1/3. So there are something like 50 billion Earths out there, or Earth-like planets out there. Now, we've got no idea how life originated on Earth, so we've got no real way of telling how likely it is for life to happen elsewhere. But if we just pull a number out of thin air and say 99% of the time life never gets hold, and so we divide by 100, we get 500 million. What about developing into complex life? Again, we don't understand the mechanism. Let's assume that 99% of the time life arises, it doesn't do anything. So we divide by 100 again, gives us 5 million. What about intelligence? We don't know. Let's assume that 99% of the time that complex life arrives, it doesn't develop into intelligence. So let's divide by 100 again. That still leaves us 50,000 civilizations potentially. So if the galaxy has got lots of potential people out there, then is it not unreasonable to say, well, although UFOs might not be evidence that the spacecraft have landed on Earth, we can still ask, why not? Aren't some of those 50,000 close enough that they could have visited, not necessarily now, but maybe 1 million years ago? Why is there nothing in the fossil record that indicates something that is not part of our natural evolution? There's lots of caveats. We've got no idea what these numbers actually are, and even if intelligent civilizations do arise, we've got no idea how long they might last. Maybe all intelligent civilizations blow themselves up in the first 1,000 years or 10,000 years. We have no real data to tell us. Until we find life somewhere else, we can't tell. And that's the problem, because that is us. The pale blue dot. Look again at that dot, says Carl Sagan. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. And that reminds us that this is the only life we know. We do not know anything about extraterrestrial life. So although UFOs are not proof that extraterrestrials have visited us, that doesn't mean they haven't, and it doesn't mean they won't. And you could argue with the conspiracy theorists that it's a bit scary to think about other civilizations in the galaxy wanting to visit us. But I think it's more worrying to think that we might be alone. Thank you for listening.